Welcome to all of our audience. Thank you very much for tuning in to our discussion today. Today we will discuss the future of European value chains in medical goods. I think we've all been shocked in the beginning of the year when we seen the pictures in Italy where Italian doctors had to perform surgeries, had to assist COVID patients without proper equipment. And this had spawned this was a massive problem and spawned quite a debate on whether we're too dependent on foreign supplies. Are we too dependent on supply chains going abroad? Are our supply chains for medical goods that we need really urgency, especially in a moment like now, are they too fragile? And do we need to improve resilience? This is what the question I want to discuss today. And I'm really happy that I have an excellent panel with me to make sense of this question. First of all, I have Giuseppe Rocco, who is the Secretary General and Chief Medical Officer of the Italian Health Ministry. I think you're an internal medicine, so you work on, so he is a physician. He has experience in medical stuff himself, but he's also managing in the management board of the European Food Safety Authority. So he also has a lot of experience on this side. Then as my second guest, I have Annabelle Gonzalez. To the trade folks in our audience, they will all know her. She is a senior fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where she hosts the excellent discussion series Trade Winds that I can warmly recommend to anyone interested in trade matters. She has been senior director of the global practice for trade and competition at the World Bank, and she's also been trade minister of Costa Rica. And my last guest is Cohen Burden. He is the executive director for international trade of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. So he is someone that brings us some experience from the medical industry. I hope he can also, but also hope he can also bring us some experience personally. He is an associate professor at the University of Rotterdam. He has done work, or he's in the management board of the World Economic Forum. So I'm really happy to have like this kind of really broad panel here to discuss this important matter. Let me start with you, Mr. Rocco. So Italy has been one of the first and hardest hit countries in Europe, and I think you faced the brunt of the first wave, especially of the shortages that we experienced. Can you tell us a little bit about what you experienced being in Italy at the time, being and also in the health ministry? What are the problems in procuring medical goods where you're facing?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Good morning, everybody. And yes, we were the first country to have the wave of the pandemic in Europe, and generally speaking, outside the Asian countries. So we cannot teach from others. We had to teach by ourselves. And this was obviously difficult, also because we had some problems that were not that was not possible to solve internally. You make reference to the mask or to other devices that are not produced in sufficient amounts in Europe. I can say that in January, so before the first cases in Europe, we already contacted the big companies and the association, the National Association of Producers of Medical Device and PPE, asking for new stock. And already we had the difficulties. Why? Because the production was concentrated in the country that already had the problem in January. So this was the best difficulty we had at the beginning for PPE and mask. Then in the following weeks, we had other problems, because when we started to use, unfortunately, ventilators, and then to use in vitro tests for PCR, specifically for diagnosis, we had other problems with reagents and so on. So fortunately, we adopted a lot of measures to mitigate this problem. First of all, about the PPE, we made some specific rules that give us the possibility to use products that are equivalent to the European one without the CE mark. I'm speaking, for instance, of the N95 masks that are similar to our PPE for protection without having the CE mark. Then we adopted a second strategy on the same products because we created a staff in the National Health Institute to have a rapid authorization of products. But in any case, these products should be effective and safe. We shortened only the time for authorization. And this was about masks and other PPE. We had more problems with ventilators, but also net. We have the Italian facilities that helped by the military engineers and military people were able to improve the production of ventilators. So in few weeks, we were able to have a sufficient stock for all the country. I have to say also that fortunately in that case, that part of Italy that was involved was only the north. We don't have all the country involved. That's different to the actual situation. Another thing that we had was that to use also some products that were produced for veterinary use, that was the propofol for anesthetic use, also for humans with special authorization. So we made some intervention to mitigate the problems. And also on drugs, you know that we don't have real products really effective or that officially are considered effective, and we did not have in that time. But we started with some trials that were all managed by the National Authority for Medicine Products. So these are the main measures we adopted in the first weeks. Now we are working with more calm in the second phase.
Thank you very much for laying out a bit what we've seen all and giving us your inside experience. Before I go to the next question, I want to remind the audience that we have, as always in this Google series, we will have a slide.do, where it's like a webpage where you can put questions to us, and in the later part of this webinar, we will answer your questions. So please, if you have questions, go to there. The hashtag is supply. Let me now go to Annabelle, to Ms. Gonzalez. Annabelle, we have seen this kind of the same problem all over the world, similar problems than Mr. Rocco just described. And basically, many countries reacted also with the restrictions of imports, with restrictions of particular goods, with exports authorizations and so on. Can you tell us a bit about the international experience and the problems that this causes for international supply chains?
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thanks for this opportunity to participate in this panel. And hello to everyone. So, in the face of COVID-19, I think that the problem is very clear. Governments need to provide timely and affordable access to the personal protective equipment, the respiratory support and monitoring equipment, the diagnostics tests and medicines. But this is, of course, not an easy problem to fix. We know that the cases of coronavirus went from 0 to, I think now, like 44 million last time I checked in a very short time period. And it was impossible for global manufacturing to keep up with such a massive increase in demand, in particular in the first stages of the pandemic. You may remember that at the time, the World Health Organization, I think in March this year, basically estimated that the industry would need to increase manufacturing by 40% to meet demand. In addition, we know that firms confronted forced reduction in production as a result of the containment measures, severe transportation disruptions, and overall business uncertainty. So no one country, not even one continent, can fight COVID-19 by itself, and trade needs to play a critical role. And this is more so in light of the following three facts. First, and I think Giuseppe was making reference to this, exports of these products are highly concentrated. Before the pandemic, four countries accounted for more than 70%, 70% of world exports of the most critical products. The EU with 38%, the US with 16%, China with 12%, and these countries are also significant importers of these products. The second point is this: there's a high concentration of exports of critical medical products, makes importers everywhere, but certainly in developing countries, vulnerable to shortages in supplies. And this is the case, for Africa, for the Middle East, for Southeast Asia, for Latin America. The top three exporters sometimes represent 80 and 85% of imports of these products. And the third point is because the pandemic trade in medical goods is characterized by the sudden change in market conditions brought about by the spread of the disease. And we, of course, have seen this in the past few months. Now, in our context, the lack of trust and cooperation among countries predating the virus compounded this challenge, with many countries rushing to impose export restrictions on key medical products, as you were mentioning, including China, European member states, the EU as such, India, the US. There's a report by the Global Trade Alert, which is this initiative that basically has counted today 92 countries having adopted a total of 215 export controls on since the beginning until October 16, which is the last update. And this includes, export bans or sometimes state requisition policies to de facto prevent exports of goods, or governments telling industries, to serve the local market with an X percentage of their production. And these export controls, further disrupted operations, hurting importers, but also exporters. Now, having said this, it is also important to say that countries move to liberalize, at the same time, countries move to liberalize imports of medical goods and medicines because, of course, they want to have access to these products. And according to this same report of the Global Trade Alert, 106 countries have executed 240 import policy reforms on these goods over this same period of time. And also, on the positive side, a recent WTO report that assesses the role of trade in the pandemic has found that initial shortages of PPE have eased as production and trade have expanded to meet this unparalleled demand spike. Trade in medical goods grew by 38.7% in the first half of the year, though specific problems remain subject to, specific products remain subject to periodic shortages and, sourcing still being a challenge, for instance, for many developing countries. And they also found that duties, taxes, and charges on these critical medical goods have temporarily been removed or deferred by a number of WTO members. Now, having said this, there's no room for complacency. One, many export restrictions are still in place, and there is a risk that export restrictions may come back in the next phases of COVID-19, unless evidence is put out there on the importance of trade to fight the pandemic, and collective action is taken to constrain the use of these measures. And there are other measures that are now coming out, and I'm going to just say very briefly that after the initial stages of the pandemic, some governments, including France and Japan and the US and others, have come up with the idea that countries would be more secure if these critical medical products were made at home. And the fact that China and India concentrated some of the production of these goods confirmed the view that self-sufficiency was the way to go, from which it followed that governments should use policy instruments like government procurement or tariffs or subsidies or others to bring production back home. And reshoring or localization of production is now presented as the way to build resilience at the country level, I have to say, despite evidence to the contrary. So, but maybe I'm going to stop here and I can talk a little bit more about this later on. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Mr. Burden to talk get his perspective as a representative of the pharmaceutical industry, of the challenges that the pharmaceutical industry has faced in kind of procuring the inputs to their productions to make sure that their supply lines work, but also kind of this kind of unprecedented demand in particular goods that probably no one really expected in beforehand to have this kind of surge in demand in the first place. Can you tell us a bit about your experience or the experience of your members?
Yes, thank you very much, Niklas. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this event on a topic that is, I think, really extremely important today, but also in the months and years to come for governments, for industry, and a lot of other actors. And thank you for the question. Having listened carefully to the two previous panelists, I think there is there are a lot of elements that I can also illustrate from a practical point of view. You asked what are some of the main challenges for the industry. I think going back to March, April, of course, the challenge that emerged was a massive increase in demand for medicines, protective equipment, etc., combined with lockdown measures, containment measures for the virus, as well as deliberate restrictive policies. The previous speaker already alerted to the global trade alert, certain restrictive measures. And these had an immense and direct impact on the industry and also the ability for industry to supply globally. The pharmaceutical industry is a global industry that does use very intensely global supply chains, and that is something that is really important. So if then an individual country puts an export restriction in place in a country where there is a large production facility for a certain product, that has an impact because it means that first of all, the product cannot easily, if at all, be exported to other countries, but it also means the product is produced in far too large quantities for the country that has the export restriction in place, and factory production could be adjusted, scaled down, because it cannot be exported and it oversupplies the domestic market in question. That has an immediate negative impact on the global supply. So one of the big challenges initially was the combination of lockdown measures, inevitable, but also the deliberate restrictive policies. Just to illustrate one example, in these complex supply chains, there were parts of input production in, for example, a country like Malaysia, where the factories of the industry were not classified as essential to be escaping the lockdown, if you will, and that led to certain challenges with supply. Now, what is also good to know, and I speak on behalf of the medicines and not protective equipment, which is, of course, a broader definition with respect to what happened in the crisis. We saw an increase in production of some medicines. The average went up, should have gone up by 40%, the previous speaker said, but for some medicines, we saw an increase in production of 900% over the past months. And that, of course, stretches the production, but it meant that overall, the industry was able to meet that demand, even though there were 600 sort of near shortage moments at some point with respect to medicines. So restricting trade may seem optimal from an individual country perspective, but it's rather detrimental from a global supply chain one. So the other big challenge and effort for the industry right now is the focus on R&D, looking at, say, a very good cooperation is happening with regulators, but political pressures for speed are not helping. Vaccines will only be successful, and industry is very clear about this, if they're also safe to take. And we do not want to increase vaccine hesitancy by trying to speed up something and cutting quality corners. That is absolutely vital and a crucial point to make, also not only now, but going forward. I should also say that the level of partnerships, the R&D partnerships that are happening are immense. It's very challenging, but both public-private and private-private partnerships have boomed in order to address COVID-19. I would say two short other challenges, and that's one is when you look at shortages, a shortage is a mismatch between what is being supplied and what is being demanded. And here there are two things I think that matter. In the beginning, the restrictions were such that it was also not clear where the shortages and demands were. Many healthcare systems are very fragmented, and a hospital would know the shortages they have, but it's very difficult at some point to know exactly what is the demand in one member state as a whole with respect to the needed medicines. So as to adjust supply or to reroute supply chains in order to meet that demand. The other point I would like to make is that, and this is, I think, still an issue today, that it's very important to use the right definition, the right approach to shortages. If what you saw in March, April is also due to the fact that people perceived a high level of risk, they started hoarding, they started to stock up medicines that were not in short supply, but because of the hoarding, it became a much larger issue. And then when people saw that stocks were running low, the hoarding even went up further. That was for individual people with paracetamol, for example, but it was also, you saw that in hospitals, where hospitals in the years before have reduced inventories in order to be more cost efficient. A low level of inventory also means dependent on immediate supply in case that inventory runs low. So there are these kind of challenges. And that's why I think it's important to stress that for the industry, it's important to make sure that a shortage of a human or veterinary use medicinal product is defined as when supply does not meet the patient need at a national level and not demand. And the last point I would like to make in general is the fact that I want to kind of emphasize the fact that the whole discussion on COVID-19 is the most important file. But there are other files that kind of come and interfere and add to these. And one element that for a policymaker is sort of a separate department, separate person, separate issue, but for industry all comes at the same time, is, for example, the issue of Brexit. In what happened in January, February this year was the industry had stocks because the stocks were there that were meant to help if the UK were to leave in January without a deal, and there needed to be a certain amount of stock ready. Those stocks were gracefully used in the beginning of the pandemic, and they're gone. But what you now see is that there is a possibility for a no-deal Brexit, which would lead to a rupturing of global supplies between the UK and the EU 27, and it would increase, therefore, the EU's resilience, it would increase the EU's dependence, on non-European actors, and it distracts the industry from the absolute top priority of COVID-19. It is for that reason that this is a related challenge. And of course, for us, the challenge is the total perspective of all challenges combined. And that's why in the Brexit discussion, we are simply putting forward very basic measures in a very practical manner that would help us make this a less negative additional element, like a mutual recognition on GMP inspections, or let's say a practical compliance period with the Northern Ireland Protocol. These are technical issues, but they require a lot of attention and potential disruption for our supplies on top of what is done. Maybe my last point, and then I pass the floor back to you, Nicholas, is the fact that I should also stress that after the initial restrictive measures taken in Europe and among member states, the cooperation we had as an industry with EU commissioners, Kyriakides and Breton, to remove some of these intra-EU restrictions, for example, introducing green lanes and other elements to make sure that this was facilitated, despite and maybe fueled also by the terrible situation that happened in Italy in the beginning of the pandemic. We saw that was a very good cooperation. The cooperation with regulatory agencies to support the R&D process through clinical stages is also very good. And what also helped us was the fact that the strong R&D system the EU has enjoyed over the last 20 years, the enabling IT environment, if you will, meant that the research from SARS in 2004, the Ebola research that has been done, could be immediately brought back to life and employed and used also to see if there were any implications and positive elements we could take from there for the COVID-19 research. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Cohen, very much for this outline of the experience of the pharmaceutical industry, which I think is very helpful. I mean, as an academic, you always look at the numbers, and sometimes it's difficult to really read into that what actually the challenges are. I want to go now in the second half of our discussion. I want to go a bit into the future, what could be the policies, and I think sometimes it presents itself a little bit as a prisoner's dilemma, that every country wants to procure the most for themselves, but then actually, if everyone does that, we disrupt the value chains, we disrupt the basically supply for everyone. We have looked at my own research. I've looked at back in April, we looked at final medical goods, and actually there's this Europe is the biggest exporter of medical goods according to our estimates, 30% of global trade. In Europe, there's a lot of talk about China, but China is actually just a small fraction in terms of, at least in terms of value of not input but final goods. So my question for the second part, and I wanted to start with you, Mr. Rocco, is basically, what are the things that you think should be changed that the next time around we not face the same situation, and also we kind of get more resilient? Is it a problem that we are too dependent? Are we at risk of, in the geopolitical struggle, maybe with China, maybe with other actors, that our supply chains might be disrupted, or is actually we just have to adjust a bit the policies that we've right now, but the system itself works quite well? What is your perspective on this question?
Yes. Italy is known as a country where there is a big production of drugs generally. So we should not have problems. But unfortunately, on raw materials, also Italy in part depends from other countries. I don't want to criminalize no one and no countries. But obviously, I think also from the lesson learned that generally speaking, we should revise the model of the industrial model and do our best to have a more diffusion of the production, a more localization of facilities, of premises in different continents at least. I understand that it's not easy to say in each country, because there are small countries, there are big countries, and also unfortunately or fortunately, the production on this product is not continuous. We should have peaks and then less need for a long time. And so probably when I say about a new model, we have to speak also of subsidies from the public authorities for certain products. We, as you know, next year we have the presidency of G20. I would like to discuss also that not only with the G20, but also with the B20, because I think this is a topic that have to be faced now, and we cannot wait next shortage or next problems. Secondly, from this crisis, we learned also that we have to adopt a new model of purchasing. In this case, we are sharing the risk for vaccines. So, for instance, in the European Union, this is a good opportunity for countries, because we are a bigger purchaser, so we have some buffers, no, that due to the fact that we are not alone. But anyway, we already spend money without having nothing in our hands at the moment. So this is a totally new model. It was theoretically discussed in the past, but probably it's the first time that it was used in a big scale. So also the advanced purchasing, risk sharing, this concept are totally new. As I was saying, in Europe, we have also the opportunity of joint procurement. That is another thing that normally is not done. There is an egoistic approach. Annabelle said that in the first phase, many countries, also Italy for some products, closed their boundaries, and because we don't have other weapons in our hands. But it's a myopic view, because if you block this, I block the other, so cannot be the right way. And so for another way that we have to use, in my opinion, is the data. We have now data on everything, and probably we have to share, obviously, with all the confidentiality clauses that are related to the industrial properties, to the patent, and so on. But sharing more data make all more aware of what is the scenario, what are the possibilities. one experiment, one thing that has been done in the last months. It is the clearing house that we developed at the European level, and Italy is participating on that. Also with some provisions, some foreseen shortage for the future, and it's a first exercise. But I think it's a good way for helping. It's not solving, but helping countries to deal with these big problems that we have. I think these are many weapons, many approaches that we have. We have to use all these in a rational and in a clever way, starting from this, what is happening, that what happens, and preparing for the future. The preparedness, we are speaking every day about the preparedness. Also, this is preparedness. We have not only prepare hospitals, but we will prepare also products, tools, device, because without that, the hospitals cannot work properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me go to you, Cohen, to just, what are the kind of the wishes that the industry would have to kind of increase the situation for you? Is your, do you think that this kind of a more localized approach is the right approach for your industry, or is it more about kind of diversifying geographically your production? And what would be the policy tools that in your view would be the right to address this?
Thank you, Niklas. Maybe to be very clear first, I think in the end, what the government industry have in common is that we want to make sure that it's the patient that gets the treatment they need, it's the patient that gets the access to the medicines that they need. So I think I would say it's a unanimous consensus that we all have to do everything possible to make sure that situations like what happened in March with PPE doesn't happen again. And I think that's an objective shared by everyone. So then the question is, how can you best achieve that objective? And indeed, we see that there is this sort of short-term response that says we don't want to depend on anyone, so therefore let's do everything in-house and localize. We believe that that's holding the stick from the wrong end and really not the way to go. In a way, it's also important, and I'm happy that I saw 3 nods when you said that, Nicholas, that it's really vital, and Giuseppe, you referred to this, the fact that we use the data to inform us on how to work. Because if you have the facts right, basically, to stay in a medical metaphor, if you misdiagnose a patient because or you use the wrong data, you prescribe the wrong medicine, and the consequences for the patient can potentially be very dire. Yeah, the patient we're all trying to save and help. So I think what is important is looking at the issue of autonomy, localization. We think that's not the right way to approach this. We think it's vital to make sure that supplies to medicines continue and are not being interrupted. So resilience is a much better concept, and that's why FBI in the beginning of the year did a survey, also in terms of getting the facts above water, in terms of what is the resilience and what level of dependence do we have. It turned out that 77% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients for the innovative pharmaceutical industry are sourced from Europe. 77%. 12% is sourced from the United States, and 9% from Asia. India, China, Japan, Korea combined. So that does not point for the innovative pharmaceutical industry to a dependence on countries like China, something that is a very persistent, I think, misunderstanding in policy circles. We then thought, well, maybe we also need to look at the industry as a whole and not just the innovative industry, because let's look at the Eurostat statistics. And if you look at the Eurostat statistics, and eSite did a study on this in halfway this year, where they basically showed that 70% of the imports of APIs come from the EU. That's a bit lower than the 77, but also the generic. So it's generic and innovative industries. Only in volume terms, so in terms of kilos of imports, the EU imports 22.5% of their APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredient used in medicines, from China. That's significant, but it's by far not close to some numbers that circulate about things like 80% dependence, etc., which is pertinently not correct. You already stated the fact that the EU actually exports around it's the largest medicine exporter in the world, 64% in fact for medicines. And that means if you're in the EU situation, you're already in a relatively resilient position. Yeah, you're in a much more challenging position if you're a developing country compared to where the EU is. So given that situation, that starting point, that factual base, reshoring or taking supply chains back, if that is followed by others, the EU would see more supply chains leave than come, and that's sort of a loss-loss situation, because that means also the opportunities for the European pharmaceutical industry to produce medicines for other areas in the world are decreasing. It doesn't mean that there are some very individual specific products where there is a degree of dependency and where also the sources of supply are limited. You see, so if there is a dependency on 3-4 countries, you still have a diversification in supply. But that is something we believe that could be looked at and should be looked at. Now, the other more long-term effect, I think, has to do with the other point I wanted to make first is the issue that what we've seen in March. We really should make absolute every effort possible that it does not happen in the same way when a vaccine becomes available. Again, that scramble for the national measure. First, you give all the vaccines to people in my country, and then you can export vaccines, because that would have the same effect as we saw in March. So I think the industry is very clear that vaccine nationalism is not the right way to go. Industry is at this moment already producing at risk. The medicine and the vaccines are not yet approved, but they are being produced because once they get regulatory approval, they have to be on the market with infinite demand instantly. The industry is also signing a lot of agreements with COVAX, with other elements in the world, in order to make sure that these are also available as broadly as possible for many countries. And then maybe my last point relates a bit to the longer-term future resilience. So if localizing is not the way to go, if stockpiling leads to the risk that, as we saw in Italy in March, in some countries there are strategic stocks of face masks, and in Italy a doctor has to go into a hospital with COVID patients without face masks, that is unacceptable. And that's the effect stockpiling has. It's at best a short-term solution, and it doesn't address the critical issue. It distorts access. What we believe is important is that you have a very product-specific analysis on where there are specific dependencies and resilience, but more importantly, and also for future pandemic resilience, because maybe in 2035 or 2040, there will be another pandemic that we have no idea is coming, and we cannot prepare for, right? Because we don't know, in the sense that we don't exactly know what's going to happen. The future is uncertain, but to increase resilience, it's very important to make sure that there is a strong R&D framework that allows the industry to move fast, whatever challenge, and be agile and to whatever challenge arises. So to be in the forefront, to look at clinical trial R&D, to make sure that that leads to advanced manufacturing, fast and advanced manufacturing of the medicines of tomorrow, and not the production of medicines of yesterday. And what reshoring does is it focuses on the medicines of today, the medicines that are being currently produced. What I think is the crucial point to add in a dynamic sense, it's also to look at who is working on the medicines of tomorrow. And that means for the EU, in terms of a policy perspective, there is now a discussion about the pharmaceutical strategy, looking at access of medicines for patients, but also at how to keep the innovative industry competitive globally. If the EU does not do the research, you're also not the first one to manufacture or to get access. So that's an important point to make. You have the trade strategy that's now ongoing in a very timely way because, for example, the EU's idea about working at the WTO on an innovative, on a system for trade in healthcare products, we believe is a very positive and strong way to go. And you have the industrial strategy that should have as an opportunity and as a focus, making the EU an attractive place to invest. And that, I think, is what would be for the industry the most optimal and also long-term dynamic way forward for a European Union. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I want, before I give Annabelle the opportunity to share her views on this, I want to remind the audience that you can send questions to us at Slido and the hashtag supply, and later we will pick up these questions. Before we come to the audience question, I wanted to ask you, Annabelle, about your views on this discussion we have in Europe, which, as we also know, heard, is like one of the big players in medical production. Is a rich economy, is a large economy. You worked with the World Bank, you come from a relatively small country. What are the problems that if countries like Europe, like US, maybe decide to to close their markets, to reshore, or to subsidize local productions? What does it do with the local trading system?
Well, I think that both Giuseppe and Con have been, very, very forceful in the arguments that they have made. Let me just add that research in the context of COVID-19 has shown that nationalizing supply chains does not make countries more resilient. And this is because I think it's fairly simple. Eliminating reliance on foreign inputs increases reliance on domestic inputs, which are also disrupted due to nationwide lockdowns. There's an interesting OECD study in the case of face masks that showed that given high fixed cost economies of scale and this nature of uncertain and intermittent demand, self-sufficiency is really highly impractical unless the state owns or indefinitely subsidizes a mass producer with vast idle capacity. So trying to lessen dependence on global value chains would put the world's population at risk by reducing access to essential supplies or making them significantly more expensive. And this is certainly the case for countries in Latin America. My own country, as you were saying, is dependent on imports. Likewise, African countries, South Asian countries, but then again, for the larger players as well, because even for a large exporter such as the EU, for example, it is clear that the EU needs to access the manufacturing capacity of the rest of the world to be able to meet demand. And there's an interesting case study, recent study by Oscar Guinea and Florian Forshaber from SAP, which shows that international trade helped the EU to buy urgently needed goods from abroad during the hardest month of the pandemic. So it is true for countries with existing manufacturing capacities of this critical medical gear. It's even more so in the case of many developing countries. So governments really need to rely on the world at large to become more resilient to fight this pandemic and future pandemics. So if cross-border supply chains are key to protect the health and the lives of people across the world, it follows that governments need to facilitate access to these critical medical goods. And this, implies on the side of importing members, eliminating the tariffs, establishing some of the green lanes, I think that Giuseppe was mentioning, expediting inspections and release of goods, expanding access to technical standards, which I think Italy did, for example, expediting conformity assessment procedures, among others. But this is only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is, of course, that if exporting countries implement measures to curb exports, then they put the rest of the world at risk. And this practices not only affect the importers, which they do for sure, but they also affect exporters. They tend to raise prices in the long run. They discourage investment and they invite retaliation. So export restrictions really provide a false sense of security. They are a lose-lose proposition, basically. So the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has strengthened the case for global trade cooperation, and the time to act is now. I do think that Italy has a very important opportunity in the context of the presidency of the next G20 to raise this issue and to bring the spotlight on the importance of trade in the context of COVID-19. And in this case, I believe that in particular, WTO members, or at least those members willing to do so, should take prompt action on three fronts. First, build a shared understanding of the role of trade in helping fight the pandemic. You know, trade is not a problem in this crisis. Trade is actually a core element of the solution. A second point is to enhance transparency and strengthen monitoring, maybe with greater analytical support from the WTO Secretariat, because this could provide members with critical, data and critical information, which in turn can ease fears relating to the trading environment. So, if governments know that there is production available, then they need not rush to put in any type of export restrictions. And third, I think that members should promptly engage in negotiations to achieve a COVID-19 bargain to liberalize imports, constrain the resorts to export restrictions, and facilitate the movement of this critical medical goods. Fortunately, some good ideas are on the table, including a proposal on the side of the EU. And I think this is very important. The reaction to COVID-19 provides another rationale for also considering strengthening the rules to govern localization subsidies, which is the problem that we are confronting or will soon be confronting as regards the pandemic.
Thank you very much for laying this out. I will now take some question from the audience. So I think the first question that will go to you, Annabelle, is from Catherine. She asked about the US election. So I think that goes again in this kind of question of multilateralism. You just lined out what could be an agenda at the WTO. At the moment, the WTO is in crisis. The US, which is a big player in pharmaceutical, but basically also you cannot avoid it in trade matters. How is it affected by the US election? What is like a contingency? If we don't see an agreement at the WTO level, what could be a large economy like the EU do in order to kind of push ahead at these lines that you said, to kind of create a trade with like-minded countries, some space for this?
Yeah. I would say that COVID-19 is a problem of a global nature, and no country will be safe until all countries are safe. So the ideal venue to go to reach an agreement in this area is to meet the WTO. Now, in the context of the U.S. position, we know that if the current administration continues to be in place, they do not favor the WTO, and there are several manifestations of that. If a new administration comes in, the candidacy has expressed that they will support multilateralism and that they will to address some of these problems. Now, if things don't work out that way, then it is important, I think, for the willing to move forward. And the EU has shown to be a willing partner in terms of fostering cooperation to fight the pandemic. So it can certainly go along. And there are many other countries around the world who also want to work together. And we have seen this, for instance, we are seeing this in the area of vaccines. We are seeing that many countries have actually come together to be part of COVAX because I think there is great concern that I think Kon was saying, that we don't want to see a repeat of what we saw on PPE in March, April, May in the context of vaccines. So, with it, the ideal situation is if all countries, large and small, can come together in the context of the WTO to reach agreement. If not possible, then willing countries, hopefully many of the large players, will also come together and try to reach an agreement in this area.
Thank you, Annabelle. Let me expand this question to Giuseppe. So Italy has the G20 presidency next year. So what is the plan for the Italian government to kind of, or what do you have a plan laid out where you say, okay, these are things that you might be able to achieve at the G20? Where do you see areas of cooperation, and where do you see areas where you think the Europeans have to go at it alone in a way?
First of all, I would like to reply to something that has been already said before, because I cannot accept that all the responsibilities are only on the states, on the countries, because I don't think it's possible to say if you have stockpiles you are okay, because you know very well that it's not possibility to have stockpiles for this kind of situation. You should have so big stockpiles that no one could have, and also the industry demonstrated not be able to give any answer for some products. And I'm not speaking on only on all. I'm not speaking of single countries. I'm speaking in general, because we had big international companies that were obliged by their country not to sell outside their products. And so it's not possible to say now that the responsibilities are only of our, I'm speaking for Europe, obviously, of our countries. It's easy. I understand that the industry would like to produce where the cost is lower, but this is not a very serious position. About, so we will discuss that, also that during our G20. Europe can play a role. As I said, Annabelle, we are demonstrating that we are trying to do an effort to create new models, to cooperate inside and outside Europe. So, in my opinion, we have to deepen the discussion. Obviously, these are first sensation. It's not a mature discussion which we have neither today, but neither in general. And in these months, we need time to elaborate something that is more complete and also complex, because the discussion obviously is complex, but all actors should work with responsibility and not considering only the game the way the game is. It's different kind of games as the only results, because as I said before, this could be a myopic vision that could be results in the short term, but now we have the responsibility to look at in the long term. I was not speaking of self sufficiency of single countries. This was not my idea. If I said, if was what you understood, is not my idea. I say that generally speaking, we cannot concentrate in one part of the world. I'm speaking of world, not of a single countries. It's not possible to have self-sufficiency for single countries for nothing in the modern world. It's totally impossible in my opinion. Anyway, G20 is, as said by Annabelle, a good opportunity to discuss on that, also with the stakeholders, not only among authorities. Authorities without stakeholders cannot do so much in the future, and they needed in the past, in my opinion. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let me give Cohen the opportunity to react to this question as well, and also to this debate discussion.
Thank you so much, and Giuseppe, thanks for that reaction. I think you raised some very important points, and it's good to clarify. I think also one of the things industry suggests, right, is looking at the ongoing pharma strategy, the ongoing trade strategy discussions, the ongoing industrial strategy discussions, that the European Union, we in no means want to advocate the EU having to go this alone or doing this on its own. It's impossible. We have a global pandemic, and as Annabelle said, if one of the countries doesn't have it solved, it will again spread in the future if not addressed. So that's absolutely clear. But I also believe that having these three strategies in construction at the moment, there is a unique opportunity for the EU to demonstrate a certain level of leadership. And it has that opportunity, and it has that economic clout in order to do this. So with the pharma strategy to set an EU's R&D approach that also helps for the decades to come. In the trade strategy, for example, I absolutely know that the EU has a lot of let's say, leeway and leverage in the multilateral setting. It's very committed to the multilateral trading system. And it's something where that leadership, I think, also somehow is needed and could be demonstrated. The industrial strategy is the same in terms of a longer term trend to support the European economy in order to flourish in a WTO compliant way. You said earlier that industry wants to produce where costs are lowest. I think the industry is a very diverse, has a very, the pharmaceutical industry is very diverse. If in a, let's say, national public procurement system, there is a tender and the criterion is price, then the EU industry for several more generic medicines is not going to be able to compete on a cost level with countries like India or China, because it's simply not possible. From an innovative pharmaceutical perspective, it's the R&D framework that really drives where location takes place. So it's slightly different than only the manufacturing part of the elements. And I think that's an important point. So when you talk about public procurement, if the public procurement also looks at resilience of supply, or looks at factors that matter from a policy perspective, not only price, you also get slightly different outcomes in terms of who's awarded contracts, etc. But that's a little bit more the generic part. And yes, we do, as an industry, try to optimize global supply chains, but that is also to try and minimize risk. Now, the challenge with COVID is that it is a global pandemic, so it doesn't hit an individual country. If you were to nearshore, or if you were to reshore domestically, once your national economy is hit, your whole domestic supply chain that you then totally depend on is hit, and you're actually more vulnerable because you don't have an alternative. I think the fact that there are some individual products where we have one country that supplies the large majority, that is an issue that is very important to look at. But that is different from trying to, let's say, reshore an entire industry or total supply chains. Thanks.
Thank you. Your last comment, I think, ties very nicely to one of the questions we got from the audience that got a lot of likes, which is kind of what basically is a local production more stable than like a distributed global production? Let me give this question to hear the perspective of Giuseppe and Annabelle for this. Maybe Giuseppe, you can go first.
I think that this kind of concentrated production, some products demonstrated. I'm not speaking, in this case, I'm speaking, for instance, of masks. So concentrated production demonstrated not to be effective. So this is the lesson that we received. So I think apart from theoretical model, the practice demonstrated that you have to change something. And so have different spread the place of production. In my opinion, is better. I'm not an economist. I'm a medical doctor, but if I was the owner of a system based on only one side of production, I would be concerned.
Annabelle, would you like to weigh in on this?
I think I would just add that, in the first month of the pandemic, it was very difficult to react. Governments did not have the evidence at the time. But at this point, the evidence is out there. And in the same way in which medical doctors have learned how to treat patients better in the context of COVID-19 and can actually save more lives today than they could at the beginning of the pandemic, in the same way, policymakers also learn from the evidence and put in place better policy making, better policies to fight the pandemic and save lives. I think I would just like with a quote from a colleague of mine at the Peterson Institute, Mary Lovely, who says that the public record needs to be corrected. We now have the evidence. We know what has worked, what has not worked, and it is important that policymakers align with that evidence, because COVID is going to be here still for a while, but there will also be other pandemics, and we must learn from this terrible experience to do it better in the future.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes very nicely our discussion, and I feel there's a common theme here, at least on this particular question. I'm sure, I mean, there has been many more questions in the audience. I'm afraid we will not be able to answer all of them, but I'm sure this is a debate that will go on, and we will have many more opportunities to discuss this question. I want to thank very much my three discussants for this excellent discussion. It was really a pleasure, and I hope we can continue this discussion in the near future. Thank you very much.